The first indication something was amiss in my life appeared so innocuously I almost missed it. A misplaced folder in my meticulously organized studio. The folder containing the preliminary sketches for the Morrison Commission, a $30,000 project that represented my largest contract of the year. I found it tucked beneath a stack of reference books where I never would have placed it. Odd, I murmured, returning it to its proper place in the filing cabinet. I've maintained the same organizational system for nearly 20 years. Ever since the Whitney Museum featured my Temporal Boundaries series in 2003 and my career finally gained the momentum I'd spent decades building toward. Success demanded structure as commissions and exhibitions multiplied. So did the administrative details. Each project had its designated folder. Each sketch, its precise location. My studio wasn't just a creative space, it was an archive of my life's work, meticulously cataloged. That was Tuesday. By Friday, I noticed my silver palette knife, the one with the hand-carved olive wood handle that my father had given me before he passed, was missing from its customary spot in my brush roll. I spent nearly an hour searching every corner of my studio, even checking the trash bins and the sink drains, but it had vanished completely. The knife wasn't just a tool, it was a talisman. My father had presented it to me on my 25th birthday, the day I opened my first studio in a converted warehouse downtown. Real artists need real tools, he'd said, pressing it into my palm. He was a practical man, a carpenter who'd spent decades creating functional beauty from raw lumber. He'd never fully understood my abstract expressionist phase, but he'd supported me anyway, showing up to every exhibition with his hands scrubbed clean of sawdust and his pride visible in every line of his weathered face. I'd used that knife to mix colors for every significant piece I'd created since. Its weight was familiar in my hand, the balance perfect, the edge worn to a personal curve that matched my working style. And now it was gone. Rain streamed down the studio's north-facing windows as I searched, casting rippling shadows across the polished concrete floor. Outside, Seattle continued its perpetual winter weeping, the gray sky mirroring my growing unease. I'm not normally the type to misplace things. In my 43 years as a professional artist, I'd developed systems bordering on obsessive. Every tool had its place. Every material was inventoried. It was the only way to manage a career that demanded both creative chaos and business precision. My studio occupied the top floor of a former textile factory in the Arts District. 3,000 square feet of renovated industrial space, with exposed brick walls, 16-foot ceilings traversed by original steel beams, and banks of north-facing windows that bathed the space in the perfect indirect light painters covet. I'd purchased it 15 years ago when the area was still mostly abandoned warehouses and struggling artists. Now it was surrounded by upscale coffee shops, boutique galleries, and luxury condos. The real estate value had tripled, but I stayed for the light, that perfect, diffused northern exposure that rendered colors true and shadows soft. The main workspace dominated the center of the studio. 3 easels of varying sizes, a massive oak drafting table salvaged from an architectural firm that went digital, and custom-built shelving units housing hundreds of paints, mediums, and tools. Against the far wall stood industrial metal shelves containing works in progress. The eastern corner housed my business area desk, filing cabinets, computer equipment, and tucked away in the western corner, behind a sliding barn door recycled from an actual barn in eastern Washington, was my private workspace, the sanctum where I developed my most experimental techniques, stored my most valuable materials, and kept my personal archives. "You probably just left it at a client meeting," Eliza suggested when I mentioned the missing knife. She was preparing canvases in the corner of the studio, her methodical stretching and gessoing a rhythmic counterpoint to my own work. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, a few escaped tendrils framing a face that could have been carved by a Renaissance master. High cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes so deep brown they appeared almost black in certain lights. "I never take that knife to meetings," I replied, still scanning the shelves. "It was my father's." Eliza shrugged, turning back to her work. At 29, she'd been my assistant for just over a year, recommended by the university's fine arts program as their most promising graduate. Her portfolio had impressed me immediately, technically flawless, conceptually ambitious. Her letters of recommendation described her as disciplined, meticulous, and exceptionally talented. The art department chair had pulled me aside at a faculty exhibition to tell me she was the most promising student they'd seen in a decade. I'd been hesitant to take on help. I'd worked alone for decades, but my arthritis made stretching large canvases increasingly difficult. The joint pain in my hands worsened each winter, and Seattle winters seemed to stretch longer every year. Some mornings, I could barely grip a brush until I'd soaked my hands in hot water for 20 minutes. Eliza had proven herself indispensable almost immediately. She was organized, efficient, and possessed a nearly encyclopedic knowledge of art history and techniques. She prepared materials to my exact specifications, managed correspondence with galleries and clients, and maintained the studio with religious attention to detail. She'd even developed a special paraffin-based hand treatment that helped ease my arthritis pain on particularly bad days. "The Kensington Gallery called," she said, changing the subject. "They want to know if you'll have the Harrison commission completed in time for their spring exhibition." "Tell them yes. I'm ahead of schedule." I frowned, still thinking about the knife. "Have you seen my reference photos for that project? The architectural studies?" Eliza looked up, brow furrowed. "I organized them in the blue folder last week. Should be on your desk." That was the thing, Eliza was helpful. Too helpful sometimes. I'd find my materials rearranged in ways that made perfect sense but weren't my system. She was always organizing things for efficiency. It had bothered me at first, this subtle reshaping of my space, but the changes were always logical improvements. Hard to complain about increased efficiency. "Did you move my reference photos for the Harrison project?" I asked a week later, when an entire folder of carefully cataloged architectural images disappeared from my desk. "No," Eliza said, not looking up from the color swatches she was organizing. "Have you checked your filing cabinet?" The filing cabinet was exactly where they should have been, but I was certain I'd left them on my desk the night before. I worked from those photos daily. Filing them away made no sense. "Found them," I said, not mentioning my certainty that I hadn't put them there. "You're working too hard," Eliza said, bringing me a cup of Earl Grey with a splash of milk, exactly how I preferred it. "The Zimmerman retrospective is stressing you out." She was right about the stress. The Zimmerman Museum was hosting a major retrospective of my work, 35 years of my career displayed chronologically through 67 key pieces. The show would open in for months, and the pressure was immense. Critics who had dismissed my early work would now be reassessing it in the context of my later success. Collectors who owned my pieces would be judging whether the exhibition increased or decreased the value of their investments. And younger artists would be looking for signs of relevance or evidence that I was becoming a relic of a fading aesthetic. "I'm fine," I lied, sipping the perfectly prepared tea. "Just scattered." That night, I made a detailed inventory of everything in my private workspace, the small room off the main studio where I kept my most valuable materials and unfinished works. I photographed each shelf, drawer, and cabinet with my phone. Call it paranoia or just an abundance of caution, but something felt wrong. The next disappeared item confirmed my suspicions. A small velvet pouch containing 3 semi-precious stones I used for pigment preparation, a chunk of lapis lazuli, a piece of malachite, and a small but valuable ruby I'd been saving for a special project. The pouch had been in a locked drawer in my private workspace, a drawer that only I had the key to, or so I thought. I discovered the theft on a Tuesday morning in March. Seattle's endless winter had briefly relented, allowing weak sunlight to spill through the windows. I was planning to begin work on a commissioned triptych for a tech executive's vacation home in Sedona desert landscape rendered in vibrant mineral pigments. The concept required the deep ultramarine blue that only genuine lapis lazuli could provide, the perfect oxidized green of malachite, and, for the sunset's focal point, the blood-rich crimson I planned to derive from the ruby. I unlocked the drawer, reached for the familiar weight of the velvet pouch, and found empty space. My heart rate accelerated immediately. I removed each item from the drawer, thinking perhaps the pouch had shifted position. Nothing. I checked the adjacent drawers, then the cabinet above, then the small safe built into the wall behind my reference books. The pouch was gone. The ruby alone was worth over $3,000, a gift from a collector in Dubai who'd commissioned a series based on ancient trade routes. The lapis and malachite were less valuable financially but equally irreplaceable for my specific technical needs. I'd sourced the lapis directly from a mine in Afghanistan, the particular deposit known for its minimal calcite inclusions and exceptional ultramarine saturation. "Eliza," I said casually at lunch, "have you ever made your own pigments from raw stones?" She glanced up from her tablet. "I took a workshop on historical pigment methods in my final year." "Why?" "Just curious. I seem to have misplaced some of my gemstones." Her expression remained perfectly neutral. "That's unfortunate. Were they valuable?" "The ruby was. Family heirloom. I've been saving it for the right project." She nodded sympathetically. "I'll keep an eye out." I studied her as she returned to scrolling through her tablet. Eliza had become a fixture in my life over the past year, arriving each morning at precisely 8:30, always impeccably dressed in practical but elegant studio clothes, usually black jeans and a crisp button-down shirt, sometimes with a tailored vest or blazer that she'd remove before beginning physical tasks. Her movements were economical, her posture perfect. She rarely spoke about her personal life, deflecting questions with generalities about exhibits she'd attended or books she was reading. What did I really know about her? The university had vouched for her talent and work ethic, but people are complex. Even the most seemingly transparent individuals have hidden depths, private motivations. I'd learned that lesson painfully in my 30s when my former gallery representative had sold 3 of my pieces through back channels, pocketing the money while telling me the works hadn't generated interest. After Eliza left that evening, I checked the security system. The studio had a basic setup: door and window sensors, motion detectors in the main room, all disarmed with a keypad code. The system recorded entries and exits. According to the log, there had been no unauthorized access. I scrolled through 2 weeks of records. Eliza's code showed regular usage: arrival between 8:25 and 8:35 each morning, departure between 5 o'clock and 6:30 each evening. Nothing unusual there. My own code showed my typical pattern: early arrivals around 6 a.m. when insomnia drove me to work before dawn, departures rarely before 7 p.m., occasional late-night sessions that stretched past midnight when a project seized my full attention. But something stood out. 3 instances in the past 2 weeks when Eliza's code had been used to enter the studio after hours: once at 10:47 p.m., once at 9:22 p.m., and most recently at 11:05 p.m. 2 nights ago. Each time, she'd stayed less than 30 minutes. I spent the evening reviewing my finances. The missing items now totaled nearly $7,000 in value. Not enough to threaten my livelihood, but significant. More troubling was the violation: someone was taking things from my personal space, things that mattered to me. I considered confronting Eliza directly, but something held me back. If she was stealing from me, a direct accusation would put her on guard. She might deny everything, might become more careful, might destroy evidence. And if by some chance I was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation, I'd damage a productive working relationship and possibly harm the career of a talented young artist. No, I needed certainty. I needed proof. The next morning, I arrived at the studio before dawn. The security pad blinked green as I entered my code, the system disarming with a soft beep. Outside, the city was still dark, streetlights casting pools of amber on wet pavement. Inside, the studio was exactly as I'd left it, or seemed to be at first glance. I moved through the space methodically, checking each area against my mental inventory. Everything appeared normal until I reached my private workspace. The lock on the door was engaged, but when I stepped inside and checked my desk drawer, the one that had held the missing gemstones, I noticed something odd. The stack of conservation papers I kept in the back corner was slightly askew, tilted perhaps 5 degrees from its usual position. Someone had searched the drawer again, looking for more valuables, and hadn't replaced the contents exactly as they'd found them. An amateur's mistake. While preparing my workstation, I casually mentioned to Eliza when she arrived that I'd be attending a gallery opening that evening. The Wilson retrospective, she asked, hanging her coat on the rack by the door. Today she wore charcoal gray jeans and a deep burgundy shirt that caught the red undertones in her dark hair. Yes, the director specifically requested my attendance. Apparently several major collectors will be there. It should be interesting. His late work has been controversial. You'll lock up? I asked, knowing her answer would be yes. It always was. Of course, she replied, not looking up from the canvas she was priming. What time is the opening? Starts at 7. I'll probably be there until at least 10. I spent the day working on the Sedona triptych, mixing alternative pigments to replace my stolen gemstones. The results were adequate but lacked the luminous depth I'd planned for. Eliza worked quietly in her corner, preparing canvases and organizing shipping materials for an upcoming delivery to the Zimmerman Museum. At lunch, she mentioned a lecture series at the university. The Visiting Artist program has a phenomenal lineup this semester. Several pioneers in digital physical integration. You should consider attending. Perhaps, I said, though we both know I rarely attended academic functions. The university art world made me uncomfortable. Too much theory, not enough craft, too much politics, not enough passion. They specifically mentioned your influence on contemporary landscape abstraction, she added, a subtle appeal to my vanity. I smiled noncommittally and changed the subject. The Morrison Commission is nearly ready for delivery. Would you prepare the shipping documents tomorrow? At 6:15, I packed up my portfolio and coat. Enjoy your evening, I said to Eliza, who was still working on inventory records. Don't stay too late. I won't, she promised. Good luck with the collectors. I left at 6, drove around the block, parked behind the deli across the street, and waited. The evening was unusually clear for March, the sky deepening from azure to indigo as darkness fell. Lights came on in the surrounding buildings, creating a patchwork of illuminated windows across the district. At 8:45, I watched through my binoculars as Eliza locked the studio door behind her. Instead of heading toward her apartment in Capitol Hill, she walked 3 blocks to an upscale coffee shop that doubled as a wine bar in the evenings. Through the window, I could see her meet a man in an expensive suit, tall, with salt and pepper hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being listened to. Even from a distance, I recognized him. Julian Hargrove, owner of Hargrove Galleries, one of the most prestigious contemporary art dealers in the Pacific Northwest. His 3 gallery locations, Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver, represented some of the region's most successful artists, and some of its most exploited. Julian had approached me early in my career, offering representation when my name was still unknown. His terms had been predatory: 60% commission, exclusive rights to all sales, ownership of digital reproduction rights. I declined, choosing instead to build relationships with smaller, more ethical galleries. It had taken longer to establish my career, but I'd maintained control of my work and kept a higher percentage of my sales. Over the years, I'd heard rumors about Julian's business practices. Artists signed with dreams of exposure and success, only to find themselves locked into restrictive contracts, their work undervalued and their careers stagnating while Julian profited from their talent. Several promising artists had stopped producing altogether after experiences with his gallery, and now he was meeting with my assistant. They spoke intently for 20 minutes. When they stood to leave, the man placed his hand on the small of her back in a gesture too intimate for a casual acquaintance. They walked to a luxury apartment building 2 blocks away and disappeared inside. Julian's Seattle Pied Terra, according to Art World Gossip, a place where he conducted private business away from his family home in Madison Park. I waited 30 minutes, then returned to my studio using the rarely used back entrance. The security code hadn't been changed in years. I'd never seen the need. Inside, everything looked untouched, but I knew better now. I checked my private workspace. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the sense of intrusion hung in the air like the lingering scent of unfamiliar cologne. On my desk calendar, I noticed a small mark next to Friday's date, a tiny star drawn in pencil that I hadn't put there. Someone had been checking my schedule. The pieces were coming together. Eliza was working with Julian Hargrove. She was stealing small, valuable items from my studio, items that wouldn't immediately be missed but would fetch good prices through private sales. And she was gathering information about my work, my schedule, my finances. But why? Julian dealt in paintings and sculptures, not art supplies or personal memorabilia. The stolen items weren't significant enough to be worth the risk of criminal charges if I discovered the theft. There had to be a larger plan, a bigger target. I needed more information. The next day, I made a point of leaving my tablet unlocked on my desk when I went to the supply room. The browser was open to my bank's website. I lingered in the supply room long enough for curious eyes to see the 6-figure balance in my investment account. Over lunch, I mentioned a potential sale to a museum in Chicago. They're interested in the entire Harbor series, I said, cutting my sandwich precisely in half. It would be my largest sale to date. That's wonderful, Eliza said, her eyes brightening with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. Those pieces are some of your best work. The curator thinks so too. I'm preparing the authentication documents this week. That afternoon, I noticed Eliza texting more frequently than usual. Her phone kept buzzing with incoming messages, which she checked surreptitiously when she thought I wasn't looking. Twice, she stepped outside to take calls, returning with slightly flushed cheeks and an air of suppressed excitement. I continued my subtle information campaign over the next few days. I left bank statements visible on my desk. I took a call from my investment advisor while Eliza was within earshot, discussing potential diversification of my portfolio. I mentioned offhandedly that I was considering downsizing, perhaps selling my vacation property on Orcas Island. Really? Eliza looked up from her cataloging. That beautiful waterfront studio. I thought you loved working there in the summers. I do, I sighed theatrically. But at my age, maintaining two properties is becoming cumbersome. And the ferry schedules are so restrictive. I understand, she said, her tone sympathetic but her eyes calculating. Simplifying can be liberating. Time to set my trap. Over the next week, I mentioned an upcoming artist retreat in Santa Fe 10-day affair starting Friday. Eliza offered to water the plants and check on the studio while I was gone. That would be wonderful, I said. Oh, and if anyone from Christie's calls, tell them I'm still considering their offer. Christie's? Eliza's eyebrows rose slightly. Are you selling something? I waved my hand dismissively. Just exploring options. My financial advisor thinks it's time I liquidated some assets. I paused, as if something had just occurred to me. Actually, would you mind feeding my fish too? The instructions are on the cabinet. I didn't know you had fish. Just one. A Japanese fighting fish. Beautiful creature. The tank is in my private workroom. The private workroom was where I kept my most valuable materials and unfinished works. It had a separate lock, and I'd never given Eliza access. Until now. Here, I said, handing her a key. Just in case of emergencies. The fish food is in there too. I watched her carefully as she took the key. Her fingers closed around it with casual nonchalance, but I caught the momentary widening of her pupils, a physiological response to opportunity that she couldn't control. I'll take good care of everything, she promised. You deserve a break. The Zimmerman retrospective has been consuming all your energy. That evening, after Eliza left, I worked methodically to prepare my trap. First, I installed a motion-activated camera disguised as a paint can, positioned to capture anyone entering the private workroom. Then I set up a small, innocuous-looking humidifier in the corner, another disguised camera, this one with a wider angle to capture the entire room. The centerpiece of my trap was more elaborate. I placed a flat archival box on my work table, labeled Christie's Appraisal, signed Hokusai print, do not handle without gloves. Inside was a stunningly detailed reproduction I'd created years ago as a technical exercise, good enough to fool an amateur, but any serious collector would immediately recognize it as a copy. Beneath the print, I placed a pressure-sensitive dye pack similar to those used by banks, but modified to release a smaller amount of permanent blue dye custom-made by a theatrical effects specialist who owed me a favor from a project we'd collaborated on for the Seattle Opera. Anyone lifting the print would trigger it. I also prepared a secondary trap. In my desk drawer, the same one the gemstones had disappeared from, I placed a small velvet pouch similar to the stolen one. Inside were 3 ordinary rocks painted to resemble semi-precious stones, coated with a clear resin containing microscopic particles of fluorescent powder. The powder was invisible in normal light but would glow bright green under ultraviolet illumination. Anyone handling the fake stones would unknowingly mark themselves and anything they touched afterward. Friday morning, I made a show of loading my car with luggage, said goodbye to Eliza, and drove away. I checked into a motel just outside town, waited 3 hours, then returned using a rideshare service that dropped me off a block away. The driver, a chatty woman in her 50s, seemed puzzled by my request to be let out in an industrial area as evening approached. You sure this is right? She asked, peering through the windshield at the largely deserted street. Absolutely, I assured her. I'm meeting friends at a studio nearby. I tipped generously to discourage further questions. I entered the building through the service entrance, using my key to access the freight elevator that would take me to the floor below my studio. The building had originally been designed with connected floors for the textile operation. A private staircase in the maintenance closet still provided access between levels. Few people knew about it. It wasn't on any current building plans, and the downstairs tenant, a commercial photographer who used the space primarily for equipment storage, was currently on assignment in Europe. I settled into position in the storage closet across from my private workroom, door cracked just enough to see anyone who entered. The closet was cramped and dusty, filled with rarely used supplies and stretcher bars for oversized canvases. I'd brought water, energy bars, and a small camping cushion to make the weight bearable. Hours passed. I reviewed the details of my plan, considering contingencies. If Eliza discovered me, I would claim insomnia had driven me back to work despite my supposed trip. If she brought others with her, Julian, perhaps, or unknown accomplices, I had a small canister of industrial-grade pepper spray in my pocket and my phone ready to dial emergency services. Just after midnight, I heard the distinctive electronic beep of the security system disarming. The main studio door opened and closed softly. Footsteps moved confidently through the main studio. No flashlight. Whoever it was knew their way around in the dark. The footsteps paused briefly by my main work area, then continued toward the private room. A key turned in the lock. The private workroom door opened, and Eliza stepped inside, phone in hand, its flashlight illuminating her face from below. She wore black jeans and a dark hoodie burglar's attire, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She looked different, somehow harder, more focused, her usual warm demeanor replaced by cool efficiency. She moved directly to the archival box, set down her phone, and pulled on a pair of cotton gloves. Ironic attention to conservation practices for a thief. When she lifted the lid and reached for the print, I stepped out of hiding. "It's a fake," I said quietly. Eliza gasped, spinning around. In her surprise, she dropped the lid, jostling the box and triggering the die pack. A soft PFFFT sound, then a cloud of ultramarine blue erupted upward. The die settled on her hands, face, neck, anywhere skin was exposed. Even in the dim light, I could see the shock and horror dawning on her features, now stained a deep, permanent blue. What is this?" she sputtered, looking at her hands in disbelief. "Concentrated indigo dye. It'll fade from synthetic materials after about 30 washes, but skin, that'll stay blue for at least 3 weeks." I turned on the lights, smiled for the camera. Her eyes darted to the disguised camera, then back to me. "I can explain, let me guess. Your boyfriend, the art dealer, I saw you meeting, convinced you that I wouldn't miss a few small items. That an old woman like me probably has insurance anyway. That I'm so scattered I'd never notice." Her silence was confirmation enough. Blue-stained fingers twisted together nervously as the dye continued to set into her skin. "Julian and I," she began. "Julian Hargrove," I interrupted. "I've known about him longer than you've been alive. His reputation precedes him." "It's not what you think," she insisted, her voice steadier now, regaining composure despite her absurd appearance. "This isn't about stealing trinkets." "No. Then what exactly is it about?" I gestured toward the desk drawer. "The gemstones, my father's palette knife, my bank accounts. Because let me tell you, Eliza, theft is theft, whether it's a trinket or my life's work." "Your life's work," she repeated, with an emphasis that caught my attention. "That's exactly what this is about." I studied her blue face, trying to read past the obvious shock and embarrassment. Despite everything, she didn't look afraid. Caught? Yes. Humiliated, certainly. But not frightened, not desperate. There was something else in her expression, a determination, a conviction that made me uneasy. "Here's what happens next," I said, keeping my voice level. "You're going to return everything you've stolen, or I send this footage to the police, the university, and every gallery and collector in a 100-mile radius. Your career will be over before it begins." "You don't understand," she whispered. "Julian said your work is undervalued, that you're sitting on a fortune, but too stubborn to capitalize on it. We were going to help you, by stealing from me, by introducing your work to the right people. Yes, I took a few things to show him, but it was to convince him of your talent. And my palette knife, the one from my father, was that also to showcase my talent?" She looked away, blue-stained tears streaming down her face. "Julian said collectors value provenance items with personal history. He wanted to see what kind of story we could build around your work." "You went through my private papers," I said, remembering the misplaced folder. "You were gathering information about me." She nodded miserably. "Julian said the market loves artists with compelling narratives. He wanted to know if you had any exploitable angles." "Exploitable angles," I repeated slowly, disgust rising in my throat. "You mean personal tragedies or scandals that could make my paintings more marketable, more collectible?" "It's not," she began, then stopped herself. "Yes, that's exactly what he wanted." The cold calculation behind it made my stomach turn. Julian had been trying to find ways to commodify not just my art but my life story, to package and sell my personal history alongside my paintings for maximum profit. And the gemstones. He has connections with jewelry designers. Said we could create a limited edition line inspired by your work, using the same materials you use for pigments. I laughed bitterly. So innovative. Did Julian happen to mention that he'd be the one profiting from all these brilliant ideas? Or was he planning to cut you in on the deal? Something shifted in her expression. Doubt flickered across her blue-stained features. "We're partners. He values my artistic insight. Does his wife know that?" Eliza's blue face went pale underneath the dye. "What?" "Julian Hargrove, gallery owner, married to Rebecca Hargrove, the philanthropist whose family money bankrolled his first 3 galleries. I've been in this business for decades, Eliza. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize one of the most notorious exploiters in the industry? She stared at me, blue hands trembling slightly. He's getting divorced. He's been getting divorced for 15 years. It's his favorite line for young artists. I shook my head, disappointment mingling with my anger. You're talented, Eliza. Genuinely talented. Why throw it away on someone like Julian? Because talent isn't enough. The words burst from her with sudden intensity. You don't understand what it's like for my generation. There are thousands of talented artists graduating every year, drowning in student debt, working 3 jobs just to afford studio space. We can't just wait to be discovered like your generation did. Is that what you think happened to me? That I was discovered? I gestured around the studio. I spent 15 years working night shifts at hospitals so I could paint during the day. I lived in unheated warehouses, ate ramen for months at a time, sold paintings for less than the cost of materials just to get my name out there. Success didn't find me, I clawed my way toward it one exhibition at a time. And now you're established, she countered. You have name recognition, collector interest, but you're only using a fraction of your market potential. Julian says you could be selling for 3 times your current prices with the right representation. And let me guess, Julian is the right representation. She didn't answer directly. He has contacts your current galleries don't. Collectors who specialize in Pacific Northwest artists. Museums looking for major acquisitions before the market peaks. The Zimmerman retrospective is just the beginning. I studied her face, seeing past the blue dye to the ambition beneath. How long has this been going on, this partnership with Julian? She hesitated, then apparently decided honesty was her best strategy. Since before I applied to work with you. He approached me at my graduate exhibition. Said I had promised but needed the right connections. When he learned I'd applied to be your assistant, he saw an opportunity. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. Not just opportunistic theft, then, but a calculated long game. So everything your interest in my techniques, your questions about my career, it was all reconnaissance for Julian. Not everything, she said quickly. I do admire your work. I've learned more from you in a year than for years in art school. That wasn't fake. But you still plan to steal from me. To use what you learned to help Julian exploit my career. We weren't stealing your work, she insisted. We were creating a strategic marketing plan for your existing pieces. The small items were just research. Proof of concept. Proof of concept, I repeated flatly. And what exactly was the concept you were proving by taking my father's knife? She looked away. Julian wanted to create a narrative about your early influences. The knife had your father's initials on it. It connected to the carpenter theme in your foundational works. I felt physically ill. They hadn't just been stealing objects, they'd been constructing a marketable mythology around my life, cherry-picking personal details to create an appealing story for collectors. I trusted you, I said, the words heavy between us. I let you into my world. I taught you techniques I've never shared with anyone else. I'm sorry, she whispered, and for the first time, I believed her. It started small. Julian said you'd never notice. Then it became easy. I nodded slowly. Betrayal often starts that way. I moved to the desk and pulled out a notepad. I want a list. Everything you took, where it is now, and how you're going to get it back. She wrote with blue-stained fingers, the list growing longer than even I had suspected. When she finished, I took the paper. One more thing. Your phone. She hesitated, then handed it over. I scrolled through her text messages with Julian, photographing the most incriminating ones with my own phone. The casual way they discussed stealing my work made my hands shake with rage. I could press charges, I said, returning her phone. Art theft over $5,000 is a felony in this state. Please, she said, her voice breaking. I'll get everything back. I'll do whatever you want. I studied her for a long moment, this talented young woman who had chosen such a destructive path. In her blue-stained face, I saw elements of my younger self, the ambition, the fear of obscurity, the willingness to compromise for opportunity. But I'd never crossed the line into theft, into betrayal of those who trusted me. What I want is for you to learn something from this. I have, she said quickly. I'll break things off with Julian. I'll return everything. Just please don't report this. It's not that simple. I gestured to her blue skin. You're going to be wearing evidence of your choices for the next few weeks. People will ask questions. She touched her face, wincing slightly. I'll say it was an accident, a pigment demonstration gone wrong. And Julian, what will you tell him? Her expression hardened. The truth, that I'm done being his spy. He won't like that. I don't care. I should never have trusted him. She looked around the private workspace, at the trap she'd fallen into, at the camera is still recording. I should never have betrayed you. You've been nothing but generous to me. Generous but naive, apparently. I sighed, suddenly feeling every one of my 6 to 7 years. Go home, Eliza. Take some time to think about what you want your career to be, what kind of artist you want to become. The blue skin should provide plenty of reminder. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice small. I haven't decided yet. But Julian needs to understand there are consequences for his actions. For both of you. The next day, Julian Hargrove received an email from me containing photographs of Eliza's blue-stained face and hands, along with screenshots of their text messages discussing the theft of my work. The subject line read, "Return everything by Monday or these go to the police and the art world press." His response came within hours, a terse email claiming unfortunate misunderstanding and no malicious intent. He expressed shock at Eliza's independent actions and assured me he had no knowledge of any appropriated items, throwing her under the bus already. Exactly as I'd expected, I forwarded his response to Eliza with no additional comment. Her reply appeared in my inbox at 3:17 a.m. a single line. I see who he really is now. 3 days later, a box arrived at my studio. Inside was everything Eliza had taken: the palette knife, the gemstones, reference photos, and items I hadn't even realized were missing. At the bottom was an envelope containing $5,000 in cash and a handwritten note from Julian. Consider this compensation for any inconvenience. I trust this matter is now closed. The money felt tainted, corrupted by the betrayal it represented. I donated it to the university's scholarship fund for ethics in arts management. The Zimmerman retrospective opened 2 weeks later. Critics praised the chronological arrangement that showcased the evolution of my techniques. Collectors circulated through the gallery, appraising works they might have overlooked previously, now recontextualized by the comprehensive exhibition. The event was a success by any measure, yet I felt strangely detached from the celebration. Betrayal has a way of coloring everything that follows it. Julian Hargrove made an appearance at the opening, moving smoothly through the crowd in an Italian suit that probably cost more than some of my early paintings. He kept his distance from me, but I caught him studying the exhibition catalog, calculating values, likely planning his next scheme. I'd expected Eliza to stay away, but she appeared near the end of the evening. The blue dye had faded somewhat but still tinted her skin a noticeable periwinkle shade. She'd made no attempt to hide it with makeup, instead wearing a complimentary cobalt blue dress that suggested intentional coordination, owning her mistake publicly. We didn't speak that night, but our eyes met across the gallery. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps apology, then slipped away before the final speeches. 2 weeks later, I received another package. Inside was a small canvas, about 8 by 10 inches. It was a self-portrait of Eliza, her skin still faintly blue, her expression a complex mixture of shame and defiance. The technique was flawless. She'd absorbed everything I'd taught her and more. In the bottom corner, she'd written, "The price of my education." With it was a note, "I've ended things with Julian. He was using me to get to your work, just as you said. The blue has started to fade from my hands, but the shame won't fade so easily. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I truly did admire your work. That part was never a lie. I've accepted a position teaching foundation courses at a community college in Oregon. A fresh start, far from the temptations of the gallery world. If nothing else, I'll be able to tell my students exactly where certain paths lead. Thank you for not pressing charges." It was more mercy than I deserved. Julian hasn't given up, by the way. He's approached 3 other artists from my graduate class, looking for new partnerships. I've warned them all. I placed the palette knife back in its spot in my brush roll, where the olive wood handle still carried the imprint of my father's grip alongside my own. The gemstones went into a new hiding place, one with a more sophisticated lock. The self-portrait I framed and hung in my private workspace, a reminder that even the most careful among us can be deceived, and that sometimes the most valuable lessons leave a permanent mark. 4 months later, a notice appeared in the regional art newsletter. Hargrove Galleries faces lawsuit from artists alleging exploitation. The article detailed accusations from 6 artists who claimed Julian had misrepresented sales, underpaid commissions, and used manipulative business practices. My name wasn't mentioned, but I recognized several of the complainants as young artists from Eliza's graduate program. The following spring, I received an invitation to jury a student exhibition at the community college where Eliza now taught. The formal letter made no reference to our shared history, but a handwritten note at the bottom read simply, The students would benefit from your perspective on artistic integrity. As did I. I accepted. The college campus sprawled across several acres of former farmland in rural Oregon. Red brick buildings interspersed with modern glass structures created an architectural timeline of the institution's growth. The art department occupied a renovated barn, its interior transformed into airy studios while maintaining the rustic exterior charm. Eliza met me at the entrance, professional and poised in a navy blazer over a simple white shirt. No trace of blue remained on her skin, but something in her demeanor had changed, a steadiness, a clarity of purpose that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand formally. "The students are excited to meet you." I shook her hand, noticing the slight roughness of her fingertips, the mark of someone working directly with materials rather than directing others. "I'm curious to see their work." She led me through the gallery where student pieces had been arranged for judging. The quality varied widely, as student work always does, but several pieces showed genuine promise. I took notes as we walked, jotting down observations and questions. "This one," I said, pausing before a large mixed-media piece combining photography and painted elements. "There's something compelling about the tension between the documentary and the interpretive. That's Maya's work. She's struggling with whether art should reflect reality or reshape it." Eliza smiled slightly. "I may have shared some of your thoughts on the subject." We continued through the exhibition, discussing techniques, conceptual approaches, the balance of ambition and execution. It was the conversation of colleagues, of artists who respected each other's perspective despite their history. After completing the judging, Eliza invited me to observe her advanced painting class. I sat at the back of the studio as she guided students through a complex color theory exercise. Her teaching style was patient but rigorous, demanding precision while encouraging experimentation. "Notice how the cadmium responds differently to the linseed oil than to the walnut oil," she demonstrated, creating comparison swatches on a prepared board. "The opacity changes, the drying time shifts. Every decision you make about materials affects the final outcome." I watched her move among the students, offering individual guidance, asking probing questions, occasionally demonstrating a technique. She was a natural teacher, translating complex concepts into accessible instructions without oversimplifying the artistry involved. When the class ended, she walked me to my car. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the campus, and students hurried between buildings with the focused energy of semester's end. "You found your medium," I said as we reached the parking lot. She looked at me questioningly. "Teaching," I clarified. "It suits you better than theft." A faint smile crossed her face. "A more sustainable career path, certainly." We stood in awkward silence for a moment before she spoke again. "I want you to know that I use your story, our story, in my professional ethics seminar. Not with names, of course, but as a cautionary tale, as a lesson in consequences, in choices, in the difference between taking shortcuts and building something that lasts." She met my eyes directly. "Some lessons can only be learned the hard way." I nodded slowly. "The blue dye, best thing that ever happened to me," she said with unexpected conviction. "Forced me to look in the mirror literally and see what I was becoming." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Eliza stood watching my departure, a solitary figure against the red brick of the art building. Not a thief anymore, not a prod, but perhaps something more interesting, an artist finding her own path, shaped by both her mistakes and her attempt to make amends for them. 3 months later, I began work on a new series. Large canvases filled with figures caught in moments of moral choice, each face rendered in varying shades of blue. The first painting in the series, titled "The Silent Witness," showed a woman staring into a mirror, her reflection revealing not her external appearance but the ethical compromise visible beneath her skin. When the series debuted at the Seattle Art Museum the following year, critics called it a stunning meditation on integrity in an age of compromise and Ford's most psychologically complex work to date. What they didn't know, what only 2 people in the world knew, was that each painting contained small flecks of genuine lapis lazuli, ground into the pigment from the same stones that had once been stolen from my studio. Eliza attended the opening. I spotted her in the crowd, now a respected teacher rather than an aspiring artist. She stood before the silent witness longer than any other piece, studying the blue faces with their complicated expressions of shame, defiance, and eventual acceptance. When our eyes met across the gallery, I nodded slightly toward the painting. She understood immediately, her hand rising unconsciously to touch her now normal-colored cheek, remembering the blue that had once marked her as a thief. Some stains fade from the skin but remain permanently in memory, becoming part of the complex palette we use to create whatever comes next.